A big Olin Innovation Lab welcome to the one, really, right?
Thank you. Before I get started, I wanted to start with why am I here? And not why am I happen to be here, but why am I here generally? And believe it or not, one of my early coaches in giving presentations suggested that you should always start a story you should always start a presentation with a personal story that somehow allows people to connect with you. And she said, and by God, people really have a challenge connecting with you, so you better tell a good story. So my story begins when I'm 6 years old, and it's at the dinner table. And I lived in Portland, Oregon, so it's kind of a similar weather pattern here. So just as a kind of a reality check, right now I'm cold. This is cold. I'm at least 5 to 7 degrees too cold in this friggin' room. Normally I'd have long underwear on at this point. So I'm just honest. So there I am. I'm at the dinner table and I'm cold. So I've got a parka on, I've got a hat on, and I'm having dinner. And my mom's sitting here, and my brother's sitting here, and my older sister, well, she's 6 years older than me. She's back in the room because she doesn't have much to do with us anymore as a family. Being a teenage girl at that point. And so I sit down, and my mom says, "You have to take your hat off." And I go, "No, I'm not taking my hat off." Now, footnote, I've already developed a really good oppositional relationship with Mom. No, I'm not taking my hat off. Mike, if you don't take your hat off and you drink your milk, it'll come out the pores of your head. And it was just like, oh, my stomach crawled. God, she might be right. So I took my hat off, and I had dinner, and then about an hour later, there was this axial shift in my being, in which I concluded that not only was my mother wrong, she was categorically wrong. That everything from that point forward that will come out of her mouth, I characterized as wrong until proven otherwise with the evidence of my experience. Now, mothers, for boys, and still do, mothers are a pretty important kind of source of relatedness, being connected, the sense of being loved, and really that's where we get our sense of cooperation. So I lived life, right? The arc of my life was characterized as kicking the pooch of opportunity, one after another. Why? Because I was just, I was a jerk. I was an ass. I was inconsiderate. I was not related. I was not connected. So as a function of that, I could have been the 14th employee at Apple. Had the offer on the table. I could have been the 20th opportunity at Oracle. We get that one. Same thing for Siebel. And on and on. I could have been the 7th employee at ComputerLand. So I figure I'm at least $2 billion down in capital formation. Now, as a function of this, what happened is I've developed this exquisite see around the corners scent for opportunity and the impending loss as a function of not seeing it. So I'm here so what's the definition of an expert? An expert is somebody who's made all the mistakes and is still alive to tell about it. So I have this exquisite sense of opportunity. So my existential kind of condition of being is I am opportunity seen with a not oftentimes so gentle nudge called, hey, pay attention, you too can kick this if you're not careful. Okay. So that kind of really frames my presentation. So I'm going to outline a number of opportunities with a not so gentle nudge called, hey, you might want to pay attention to this. And so what I'm really going to be speaking to here is kind of what are some careers in IT, what are some of the upsides for that, and I'm suggesting that there's a major disruption underway, or as I like to say, the cloud consumes jobs and poops out tests. So the notion of jobs is undergoing a fundamental, radical transformation, especially in IT. And then there's a call to be an entrepreneur. and it's really going to be the business model innovation, and more specifically, a business model of one. What does that mean? And then leadership. We're going to talk about the chief innovation officer, whether you have that as a role, as a designated role or not. It's really incumbent upon us to really understand what is innovation and how it works. And then finally, what are some innovation practices? Now, I chose my title today, The Lean Enterprise Startup. Now, how many people are familiar with the book, The Lean Enterprise? Handful? Okay, so for those that aren't familiar with it, this has become the equivalent of the Communist Manifesto in Silicon Valley. Venture capital firms are now deciding whether to even have a conversation with a prospective firm based on their wholesale adoption of lean startup practices. Okay? So I'll just leave that as kind of a footnote here, that the lean startup is more than just a concept, it's more than a movement. It is quite literally now a new benchmark by which Google Ventures and Horowitz and Andreessen and the premier venture companies are now deciding whether to even have a conversation with a venture firm or not. So I can't overstate the importance of really understanding the lean startup. So let's talk a little bit about what is a disruptive innovation strategy. So I'm stealing I'm stealing something from the Kaplan and Norton, you know, the Mr. Balance, the Balance Scorecard guys. And this is what we call a strategy map. Now, a strategy map is, if you will, it is a visual depiction of an integrated business strategy. And we can work from the top down in terms of driving shareholder wealth. Now, if you're in a if you're a nonprofit, you won't have that as your overriding goal. But you'll have a similar kind of why we exist. And there's going to be a productivity strategy, a growth strategy, and a brand strategy. There's going to be essentially the value proposition that we bring to a market. There are going to be processes underneath that by which we transform raw materials, capital, and IP into a value proposition. And then there's the bottom part of that, which is going to be the people and culture. I suggest that the primary job of the CIO today is to drive transformational applications into the market. Transformational applications, according to Kaplan and Norton, are what they call them things that change the prevailing business model. So let me give you an example. So I'm at a presentation, 15 years ago, and I'm sitting here, and Jeff Bezos is here from Amazon. And so we're talking, and he says, well, and then he sets out to explain how is it that he decided to sell books. Why did they start to sell books? And he explains, well, first of all, we had a war room, big whiteboard, and we spent days and days writing down what could we sell on the internet, because we knew the internet was going to be huge. By the way, that's why he called it Amazon. It would be this mother of all rivers by which to bring goods and services to market. That was the original intent of Amazon. He says, we're going to sell everything. And then he goes on, well, why did you choose books? And he says, well, we looked at all the stuff that we could sell, and we said, okay, let's reprioritize this list in terms of things that have zero post-sale support requirements. So once you sell it, there's no customer service required. Okay? So he says, I got down to music CDs, books, seeds, garden implements, trowels and things like that. He says, okay, well, of these, which category has the absolute shit margin? What category has the lowest profit margin of all? He says, what? Now I know that sounds counterintuitive, but we wanted to go into a market where, because the margins were so thin, that it would take years, 2 or 3 times longer for the competitors to respond to us, because they had no working capital by which to reinvest in a new thing that we're bringing to market. So we went into books. Now, when you go into the book business, it turns out that 85% of the net profits of a bookseller comes from 5% of the customers. Those are the guys, like me, who buy 5 books a month, whether I read them or not. Right? The heavy book buyer. So we're going to tune our whole experience just to that 5%, with the goal of sucking all the oxygen out of the market, sucking all the profitability out of booksellers. And also, we believe that if we fundamentally created an experience for the heavy book buyer, the mass buyer will follow. So that's an example of a strategy that got expressed in terms of a strategy map. So it's really important, I believe, that when you're doing a startup or when you're doing a business, that you define a strategy that the frontline customer service person can go, oh, I get it. That's who we are. That's what we do. Okay? So let's move on. So, how many people are familiar with the notion of a force field model? Force field model? Okay, it's kind of a standard issue in consulting. So the force field model basically says, I've got a current state, and there's something I want to be, there's some place in the future we want to get. So what are all the factors that are hindering change? What's all the stuff? And some of it's going to be in terms of market conditions, some of it's going to be leadership, some of it's going to be the structure of our organization and policies, some of it's going to be process, and some of it's going to be people and culture. And there are going to be things that facilitate the change. And I'm suggesting that as we stand, I'm suggesting, and this is actually the basis of my new book called The Red Dot Procedure, is that as we stand in the present, it's possible to step into the realm of all possibility, and in this realm of all possibility, your word is law. Okay? So in this imaginary realm, I suggest that it's possible to go, let's look into the future that's comprised of myriad possible futures, and let's select one. Let's select the one future that is most thrilling, most satisfying, and most rewarding. Now, as we do this, oftentimes we'll have is just a vague, kind of vague sense of, wow, that would be cool, without a lot of pictures in it. I suggest that the people who change the world, the crazy ones, are the people who stand in the future, stand in a most thrilling and most satisfying future, and they coach the person that they are in the moment. So part of what I'm suggesting is that the rate of change has now hit a threshold. There is more stuff that's going to happen in the next 2 years than has happened in the last 10 years. And in the next 10 years, there's going to be more stuff that's happened in the last 500 years. So we're moving into a realm where our ability to predict the future is now, we must surrender the conceit that we can predict the future. Give it up. The only way that we can do it is position ourselves to surf these manifolding possibilities. And the only way to do that is to say, I'm going to go into the future. I'm going to have this vague sense of being in the future. And that's what I'm going to ask myself on a daily basis. Give me a 45-minute project today that I can do that will move me forward. So, from a cognitive unconscious, in terms of neurocomputational imaging of brain functions, 98% of what's going on in our noodle is beyond the grasp of our consciousness. So I'm talking about how do we start harnessing our cognitive unconscious? How do we start harnessing the part of our brains that really understand patterns much deeper? So I'm suggesting that part of what's incumbent upon innovators is to stand in the future and describe to their present self how to get there. Now, basically, when you stand in the future, and the future becomes as real or more real than the present, guess what you have? You have a reality distortion field. You have a vortex of creation. And that's how it is that Steve Jobs and the Bill Gates and the Larry Ellisons have created the empires, is they have a future that is so juicy, so compelling, that they're able to navigate the morass of the moment and continue to make progress against just innumerable odds. Okay? So if I was going to leave anything today, it is that. We are now into a frontier where we require the use of our imagination, much more than just having it as a plaything or as an occasional entertainment. Okay, so I want to talk about the revolution at your customer's fingertips. And we all heard about information at your fingertips. Bill Gates' battle cry in the 90s and early 2000s. Well, that has now moved to the customers. Okay. The revolution is at the fingertips of your customers. Now, what does that mean? Well, first of all, I want to talk about consumerization of IT. Now, consumerization of IT is about three things. I'll call it complexity, resentment, and choice. Most consumers, most end users of technology are sick of complexity, they're resentful about shitty choices, and they're going out and doing their own. So, when I did a survey of medium to large enterprises, I discovered that IT, and spend on IT, continues to grow at about 17% across the enterprise. But when we look at IT just in terms of infrastructure, it grows about 4 or 5% a year. So 80% of all of the growth in IT spend occurs in the line of business. And half of it is driven by marketing and sales. So all of the upside growth in IT spend occurs in line of business and largely by marketing and sales. And oh what? Guess what? They're buying stuff right out of the cloud. So this notion of talking to IT and having them deploy, forget about it. So I'm suggesting that consumerization is about seeing products. So the vendors are now responding with, I've got to have a product that is simple. I've got to have a product that is packaged like a box of cereal, and it's got to sell itself. And until I have something that's so simple, so packaged, and it sells itself, I'm basically on the hook in terms of innovating what it is that we need to bring to market. Well, by the way, half or more of the decision makers for that IT spend are female executives. Fundamental shift in terms of how IT purchase today. So what does that mean? Well, among other things, female executives tend to want to have a sense of, well, where did this come from? Who's behind it? Who are the people that are part of this overall solution? What's our relationship with it? So that's now part of the overall value proposition for vendors. It's not just about here's my product, but here's my product and here's the relationship by which we unlock the value of this product. And I suggest that is an increasing trend. So the relationship that unlocks the value of the product will become as important or more important than the product itself. Now, this may make sense to you, this may be confusing, but as far as I can tell, that is a weak signal of the future that has become stronger and stronger, in my opinion. Okay, so I'm going to skip this slide other than to say that as technology continues to, the rate of innovation continues to grow, the rate of adoption isn't anywhere keeping up with the rate of innovation. So there's this gap, and this is a gap that technology vendors are continuing to exploit, the adoption value gap. And as I said earlier before, software eats the world. That's the words of Mark Andreessen. And it's the systematic elimination of low added value labor. Okay? And another interesting thing is that if we look at the dictionary of job definitions in the last, from the 1980s, 82% of all the jobs that were defined in the dictionary of job definitions, according to the Department of Labor, 82% of those jobs don't exist today. So this is going to happen again, but it's going to happen not in 30 years, it's going to happen in 5 or 7. So the notion of a job is fundamentally disappearing. The notion of I'm looking for a skill set with X, Y, and Z capabilities is disappearing. Or another way of saying that is, part of what it means to be employed in the new economy is that you have to create your own market. You have to create your own job, largely based around driving a strategy of implementation. And then another way of saying that is, value will continue to migrate away from technology, because more and more the technology is simply a matter of configuring it straight out of the cloud, right? And it moves towards user enablement. How do we use what's in the cloud to enable a user to do something else? So the real value here is no longer about engineering stuff in the cloud, although there is still value there. It's how do we unlock it? And that's going to be, there's going to be a whole set of next practices that emerge around how do we rapidly configure pre-existing web-based services to meet very specific user requirements and onboarding those users in a fun, gamified way. That's the new challenge. And that is, if you will, the hard part of innovation. The hard part, the easy part of innovation now is coming up with cool stuff to do. The hard part is getting the dog to eat the dog food. The hard part is onboarding users. The hard part is gamifying it, using game theory, using a system of incentives and punishments, using game theory to reward good user behavior and disincentivize or demotivate bad behavior. That's now how do we bake that into the user experience? Okay. So, from a software company, I'm glad we have Adam here from Yammer. So I'm kind of stealing a little bit of what I saw at the Yammer tour thing. So this is, if you will, the business model for enterprise software companies. Now, traditionally, enterprise software companies would sell you a big license, you know, $500,000, $2 million, $500,000, $2 million upfront license fee, and another couple $100,000, maybe $1 million of pro services. And so by the time it got out to the first year, here, you had already spent 70% of the life cycle cost. And you have, if you will, ongoing 30% maintenance fees. The new model basically says, we're going to give this to you for free, or almost free. And as a function of giving it to you free, we're going to allow you to use this for as much as you want, and at some point, we're going to start asking you for a little bit of an upsell. So part of this is, part of the new value capture strategy for software companies is microtransactions. And this comes down to, we make it simple, easy to buy. There's a direct link to the desired result. It's a self-evident business case. If I can't see the business case right on the home page, I've got a funky home page. I'm saying that again. If the business case is not self-evident, just as a function of the vendor's homepage, if the business case isn't self-evident, if the vendor has not visually demonstrated the business case, then you've got a lame vendor. Next, click, bye. The other part of this is that we're going to switch on and off users and functions, and we're going to gamify the onboarding and adoption. We're going to make money as a function of incremental microtransactions. Now, that fundamentally means that I've got to instrument my product for in-product marketing. Okay? So this is the new thing. This is the new business model, and I suggest that all software companies, sooner or later, are going to move to this model. Now, so what's the business model innovation? So we're going to talk a little bit about the disruptive opportunity, the ecosystem of disruption, a hierarchy of value in what I call the market space, and the gamification, the cognitive foundation for adoption. So this is a little bit of a complex diagram. I apologize. Now, at this point, you've probably come to the conclusion of the sneaking suspicion that each one of my slides is actually a workshop. Actually, each one of my slides is the visual summarization of a book. This happens to be the visual summarization of Clayton Christensen's The Innovator's Solution in Seeing What's Next. So I suggest here that in every market, there's an existing market as well as a much larger potential market. Okay? Now this market has a hierarchy. Every market has a good, better, best hierarchy. There are ultra buyers, trade-off buyers, and value buyers. Think of this as Walmart, Target, and Neiman Marcus, right? McDonald's, Burger King, and Wendy's. Post Office, UPS, FedEx. Every market has a hierarchy. Now the distributions are generally going to be like this, and the ultra part of the market is going to represent about 15% of the market. But from a vendor's perspective, you're going to easily earn a 50% or greater net profit margin. Whereas here in a trade-off buyer, it's 20 to 25%. Or if you're doing business with Walmart, they're going to give you a 15% margin. Remember, we were talking. I was doing an executive placement in an area called digital asset management, and Walmart called us up and says, "Yeah, we want to find a digital asset management administrator for our place in Bentonville, Arkansas." And I said, "Great. Here's our fee structure." And I said, "I'm sorry, we only pay 15%." And I said, "Well, I'm sorry, but that's not what we earn." And, "Well, you don't understand. We're at Walmart. We only do 15% margin." And I said, "Well, I guess this is a short conversation." And I said, "Yes, it is." So every market has a value hierarchy in it. Now, part of this means that there's also then a value network that organizes. A value network is comprised of technologies, platforms, support, and third parties. There's a value network that organizes around. Gee, can we turn this light off over here?
Go ahead. There's nothing she can't do. Watch it.
He just jinxed it so it won't work.
Perfect.
Ooh,
Much better. So part of disrupting a market entails putting into market a good enough product for the value buyer and the non-buyer. Think of open source, right? Think of Drupal. Think of Linux. It's good enough to get a job done, but as a function of that, there's a whole bunch of people that could not normally afford something that are not able to use it, right? So essentially what that means is that I'm going to create a low-cost package solution, and I'm going to build a value network of people that are aligned with my low price point and my low cost of service, or my low cost infrastructure. So we do this by forming always-on partnerships with network consultants and solution providers, creating upmarket packages for our solution partners to sell, aligning sales and service process to a new, lower operational cost structure, and capturing equivalent levels of profit even at that price point. So this is essentially what's in the brainstem of every Silicon Valley Web 2.0 entrepreneur. How do I take an existing market, provide a new, good enough value proposition into the low end, and as a function of that, over time, I'll be able to capture more and more of the larger market as a function of really building out functions that customers want and will pay for. And that really gets to the essence of a lean startup. How do we only build stuff that people want and will give us money to buy? So how do we close the loop on building stuff that people want and people will give us money for? And that's what we'll get into later. Okay, now, here's another thing that I found. For 30 years we've done kind of economic research. So I suggest that in the brainstem of every economic buyer, CFO, who's ever writing the check, there's an informal value calculus. And so I'm suggesting for every proposed new technology, there is a probable impact. Every CFO will put you in one of these categories. So I'm just suggesting that, say, for example, we'll call it an intangible opportunity. Let's just give it an economic value of $0. And then I got a process improvement. So I'll put it in the kind of the intuitive calculus language of, I've got a pound of process improvement. I'm going to give it a value of $1. So there's a certain amount of effort associated with making a process improvement. Then I got a cost reduction, hard dollar cost reduction. I suggest that most economic buyers are going to say, that's worth $5, or it's 5 times more valuable than a fuzzy, kind of unquantified process improvement. From a sales perspective, it's 5 times easier selling a process improvement than it is an intangible opportunity. Then we've got increased revenue. I suggest that increased revenue has an economic value of $20 relative to the $5 of process improvement. Every good CFO will tell you that $1 of top-line revenue growth is 4.5 times more profitable than $1 of cost reduction. I'll say that again. $1 of revenue growth is 4.5 times more profitable than $1 of cost reduction. Or another way of saying that is, it's 20 times easier selling a solution that increases sales than it is selling a process improvement. Now, most technology vendors that I've talked to, most technology vendors that I've studied, all market and position their value proposition below the line. They, for the most part, say it's a process improvement because we don't really want to talk to our customers and do the hard work of figuring out exactly how much money and time it saves. Nor do we like to correlate any kind of productivity dividends or cycle time gains to increase sales. So as a function of that, most technology vendors heavily discount their product, and they suffer really long sales cycles because they don't do the basic homework of saying, how does this correlate to sales? In a straightforward, visually depicted, logically coherent way. Now, where we really get interesting is where our technology impacts the balance sheet or share price. Very few companies have done that. And quite frankly, there are very few things that actually do affect the material value of the firm or the balance sheet. But there are companies that do, and those are the companies that generally really break out. And in terms of public companies, they will have really high earnings multiples. Okay, so I'm suggesting that part of what we're now seeing is we're seeing a reorganization of markets around how do things increase sales and how do they create new wealth on the balance sheet. Okay, so now here's the business model expressed in what I call a process. So over here we've got a vendor, we've got a product team and a service team. Over here we've got a customer. Customer is doing, has business priorities, like what's the business case for return on investment. And then I got user priorities, user experience and personal productivity. I'm suggesting that most companies are at phase one. They sell a static feature set and they deal with user complaints and feedback. Complaints and user feedback, right? Just here's what it is, deal with it, right? I'm suggesting that as we start to evolve this, as vendors start to evolve, they're really looking at scenario-driven requests and with what I call structured listening. So they're building into their the user experience structured, multivariate data collection. That's part of the user experience. And this will then move to what I call in-product upsell. So as I'm using the product, I'll get a message within the product called, hey, you're getting close to your storage limit. Would you like to buy 5 more gigabytes? Hey, you're getting to the limited number of network connections. Would you like to add another 100 people to your network, etc. Gee, would you like you might really like to have this team room where you can manage all of your team collaborations. Upsell, upsell, upsell. It won't be $5 a month. But at $5 a month across 20,000 employees, that's a pretty good number. And then this goes into what I call self-service function mashups and organizational design capabilities. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot more time on this other than to say that for the most part, where most companies are at right now is how do we move from complaints and user feedback to structured listening. And part of that will entail developing what I call an adoption value roadmap, which is how does this whole life cycle work in terms of user experience and how do we gamify it?
Okay, Michael, if I could, just, you asked me to tell you, time check, 30 minutes. You're 30 minutes to like the big finish.
Cool.
And I want to make sure everybody knows you're going to share your beautiful visuals with everybody, right?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. So you don't have to get carpal tunnel syndrome. So just they will be distributed to you.
Absolutely. Now, it turns out, Gordon, that some people actually have to write down what they hear in order to understand what they heard.
That's true.
I'm one of those.
The teachers love you.
God bless. All right. So my point is that fundamentally vendors and technology companies must now come together around end user companies must now start providing adoption requirements. Here's how our company wants to adopt your technology. And the vendor has to now start packaging the technology like a box of cereal, what I call solution packaging. Understanding that it's a series of adoptions: trial, purchase, configuration, solutionary, brand launch, standard procedure, and the governance council. So that's the skin that vendors and companies have to put into the game. How do we drive adoption bottom up? So this is a little bit from my background in cognitive science. And this is essentially the gamification. Adam, if you move your head. So I'm suggesting that this is part, so we've got external stimulus and or internal stimuluses. There's a reaction, an interpretation, a meaning, there's feedback, there's neural bindings in terms of yes, that's meaningful or not, in terms of an attachment, yes, I want more of, or no, I don't want that. And that ultimately anchors as a commitment. So fundamentally, we could use this model to say, okay, well, what call to action do we give our user to do the next thing in terms of the user adoption? What's the action we want them to take in response to our stimulus? In some cases, it's go out and find it, or what does this mean? So we have to provide semantics. We have to provide a meaning for why the user wants to do this. And then once we've done that, it says, okay, now we've gotten feedback. Is it confirming or is it disconfirming? And exit. This right here, I'm going to call attention to, is probably one of the weakest links in the overall adoption cycle. How do we create meaningful feedback such that as I provide feedback, it propels me into, I like this, I want more, and I'm committed. So I'm suggesting that feedback, the feedback, providing feedback is now a brand event. That if you're not asking for feedback, you're not asking to be invited back to the party. So feedback is now part of the closed loop process of customer relationships. And so I'll explain that in a little bit. Okay, let's talk about the Chief Innovation Officer. So I wrote a book 12 years ago called Firebrands. And this resulted in my being invited to Finland, to Nokia. And so this was one morning, 10 o'clock in the morning, bright October afternoon, bright October morning, sorry. And I'm in this room with two guys from Nokia, Anssi Vanjoki, who was the Chief Marketing Officer, and the Senior Vice President of Marketing Services, a guy named Pekka Ranto. And now Anssi's, he's like 6'4", and he's got this really square jaw, and these really bright laser blue eyes. Now look, I don't scare easily, you know? If anything, it's just the opposite, right? This guy scared the pants off of me. I mean, he was, and he said,
Michael, this is the best business book that I read in the last 10 years.
and I go, wow, that's kind of cool. Now it took me, after I left, I said, it took me about 4 years to realize that I'd so overwritten my book, because if the owner of the 6th most valuable brand in the world at the time considered this a good book, then the rest of the people are going to look at this like, you know, rocket science, right? So then it goes on and says, would you like to know, I'd like to share with you why we chose Gray Worldwide as our agency of record. And I said, cool.
He says, first of all, I told him, show me no creative. You show me creative, I throw you out of my office right now. That you are here means that you have creative. Instead, show me the systems, processes, and accountabilities you have to manage a €500 million account, and on the basis of that, I choose.
Wow. Wow. Now that's the difference between a long-term CMO and a short-term CMO. The average tendency for a CMO today is about 14 months. Why? Because they fundamentally believe that their job is about messaging. Bullshit. The CMO who is able to keep growing his job understands that it is his primary job of building operational capabilities based on systems, processes, and accountabilities. And then Ansi goes on, the biggest problem that I have is how to design new accountabilities and drive their acceptance. That is the nub. That is the nub of innovation. So look, we've got plenty of systems, we've got plenty of smart people to figure out processes, but the hard part of innovation is designing accountabilities, which I define as an agreement by and between management and an employee about the business results that the employee promises to deliver, measured this way, and reported weekly on the following criteria. So weekly reports that are essentially progress against strategic objectives, delivering business results, is the function of a well-designed accountability. I call that a position contract. I am just stunned by the number of companies that do not have, they have got some of these fuzzy job requirements. But in terms of, well, what does that mean every morning? There's no correlation between that and the day plan of an employee. And the fact that there's no correlation between what they're supposed to do and a daily plan is the rat in the woodpile. That is the weakest link in the innovation supply chain, the lack of accountability. Not that people aren't accountable, it's just that nobody took the time of structuring, defining the accountability that includes reporting of progress on a weekly basis. Okay. This is essentially what's in the brainstem of a CMO. It took me about a day to pull this out of my. It basically says, I'm concerned about brand integrity, I'm concerned about strategic differentiation, I'm concerned about market coverage, I'm concerned about marketing or Marcom supply chain orchestration, and I'm also concerned about digital brand interaction. Right? Producing emotional connection, wow, commanding position, I'm spending more on strategic things and less on operational things, and I'm providing more and more self-service satisfactions. So this is, if you will, the blueprint by which the CIO will partner with the CMO. So what does the CMO need? What do most CMOs need? They need a partner to help co-design systems, processes, and accountabilities. It seems to me that the CIO is in the best position to help other line of business executives think about building operational capabilities. And so that's really, and that's going to come back to how do we create projects and accountabilities that a non-technical CMO will go, oh yeah, I see, A, B, C, got it, let's do that. Okay, now this particular chart is, remember I talked about how do we come up with a value proposition that's above the line? So this basically says, if I delay a product launch by 3 or 4 weeks, I have an additional cost that I have to now pay back of my development team. Or as a function of that, as a function of getting to market 3 or 4 weeks sooner, I pick up additional margin. So time to market is not just about increasing or cutting the time to market cycle. Reducing time to market creates incremental profit. And I suggest that time to market is really about how IT contributes top-line revenue growth to the company. By really understanding how much time does it take for us to currently launch a new product, and how can we enable faster launches. So that's process optimization of product launches. So if there is one thing, if I was a CIO, if there was one thing that I want to become the absolute master of, is I want to become the go-to resource for accelerating product launch cycles. That's how I, as a technologist, are going to be able to make substantive, measurable, and largely transparent contributions to revenue. How does this facilitate a product launch? And oh, by the way, the other thing that we want to have is, what is 1 day's revenue worth? Now, according to the CFO magazine interview that I read with the CFO of Merck, he says 1 extra day in market, 1 extra product sales day for a major drug like Viagra is worth $6.5 million. Every company has a similar metric. What is a 1 product sales day worth? So I suggest that's the benchmark. We were talking about, is it Kevin? Steve, sorry. That's one of the things we were talking about, ROI, right? Just how many days did we cut if every day is worth X amount of revenue? Okay. So, now this I've stolen shamelessly from the Lean Startup and Eric Ries. And he has this thing called the build, measure, learn cycle. And he says, fundamentally, what we want to do is we want to build stuff, measure the effectiveness of what we've built, and then integrate that in terms of learning. Now, I've taken that and I've expanded that notion.
Hold it up a little bit higher.
Hold it up higher.
Closer to your mouth.
Oh, okay. All right. So, I'm suggesting that what we have here is we have this notion of an activating insight. And I characterize these in terms of polarities. The positive polarity is the best expression of that particular state. So epiphanies are better than ideas. Ideas are okay. But ideas tend not to have a lot of emotional depth to them. They don't have a lot of cognitive congruence to them. Just, no, it's just an idea, as opposed to, wow, wouldn't it be cool if, right? And then it's an testable hypothesis. How then do we characterize something in terms of a testable hypothesis? And then, how do we then build a differentiating product builds? How do we build differentiation of the product? Well, oftentimes, the source of differentiation is going to come back here in terms of what we learn from our customers. Now, I left on your desk a little invitation. You open it up. Wow, everyone got a prize. So I'm suggesting that this really defines, if you will, a key metric for every chief innovation officer. And it's the time to a minimum viable product, where we define a minimum viable product as a product that sells itself, that achieves a 40% conversion rate upon presenting it to early adopters. And I'm suggesting further that this is the weakest link. How do we create transactional engagements with early adopters, and how do we collect multivariate data in terms of feedback? So I passed this thing out because I work with, in full disclosure, I work with this company called Heads Up User Engagement. I don't so much care whether you use this or not, but I want to use this, I want to convey this as a tangible example of what it means to build transactional engagements and feedback into the user experience of the product. Now, part of then is that I start to have validated learnings. I want to then have it be operationally integrated. So operationally integrated means that I've gotten feedback, and it's one of three things. It's a user story, it's a complaint, or it's a business development lead. And the user stories and defects need to go into some agile-based project management system with Kanban board-like scheduling system. So now it's now institutionally codified as, that's important, we're going to do something with that. So until feedback gets translated into a user story, a defect, or a sales lead in the CRM system, you haven't operationally integrated anything. You've got a bunch of ideas running around people's heads. So that then becomes a system of accountability for how are we incorporating transactional engagement and feedback into now what I call a semantic market presence, which is how do we take that insight and roll it back into our presence in the marketplace, and thereby telegraphing people that now we've got new things to test. So a startup is as successful as it can complete one cycle of learning. And so by the time it goes from a time to a testable hypothesis, to a minimum acceptable offer, to a time to a demonstrable prototype, 5 paid customers, and ultimately to a minimum viable product, there are some number of cycles built into this. Now I'm suggesting that product builds really have to be agile. We can't afford any more of this kind of cascade, waterfall, 3, 6, 9, 12-month product development cycles. And I suggest that one of the lessons I have that I've learned from Silicon Valley is if we're not doing a weekly product build, we're just slow. Now, you know what the product cycle is at Facebook? Twice a day. That's right. They do a product, they release new code into their install base twice a day. There's no way you're going to be able to out-innovate Facebook. No way. Especially if they're using those product builds or getting feedback in terms of, does the dog eat the dog food? Does it enhance the user experience? So, I'm suggesting that fundamentally, the job of a chief innovation officer is to own what I call this feedback cycle, and to own the systems and processes and accountabilities by which we test a hypothesis, put it into the product, see if the dog eats the food, get transactional feedback from our users, and then that goes right back into the organization in our product development process or our marketing development process or our customer development process. Sorry. Okay. So now here's a more detailed example of what I mean by transactional feedback. So if you're a DevOps, if you're doing DevOps, if you're in charge in your organization of developer operations, fundamentally you know that one of the toughest things to do is to get super betas, like beta testers, but give you really good feedback, right? So I want to be able to get a screenshot, I want to be able to get device profile, I want to get navigation history. That should be part of the UX scorecard. I also want to be able to test, well, what were the most critical needs? Reasons to adopt, adoption barriers, missing or lame features, competitive alternatives, and or price sensitive. These are all kinds of things that I want to build right into the user experience. Okay? So it's not about having somebody with a clipboard and going around, well, did you like my product? You want to put it in line of sight. So as customers begin to pound on your product, as they begin to use their product, they actually provide you structured feedback as part of an overall analytic dashboard. So I can do cohort analysis. So if I'm outside the firewall, what we did last week, how does that, for the people that came in and adopted last week, how does that compare to the people that we did last month? Is there any meaningful difference in the data in terms of adoption patterns as a function of what we learned in the last 30 days? If there's no difference, then fundamentally we're not doing something right. So I'm talking about systematic, ongoing, incremental improvements of the user experience based on real data that we've collected in line of sight. So let's do a little bit of innovation Scrum. Now, Adam, I know you don't like Scrum, but you know you're not doing weekly product build either, right?
We do more than that.
Really? Of course. I'm shocked. All right. So this is a model that I stole from an interview with Eric Schmidt on the Charlie Rose Show. And Charlie asked him, he says, Eric, tell me about the innovation culture at Google. And he says, well, Charlie, you know, I'm an engineer. And we could have I've got a PhD in engineering. And he says, we could have a conversation all afternoon about the underlying theory of the innovation and practices of Google. But rather than that, let me give you a concrete example. And he says, I had this one of my direct reports come to me with a proposal. And he said, Eric, this is utterly going to change the display advertising business. And Eric goes, cool. Yeah, but it's going to take a team of 45 people, and it's going to take 9 months to do this. And Eric goes, wait a minute. You have fundamentally miscalculated. I want you to go away and come back with a plan that requires no more than 3 people and something that you can get done in 45 days or less. You're going to fail. We know that. But I want you to fail fast and get on with what you've learned. So the whole philosophy of innovating things at Google was small teams, rapid cycles. There are very few projects at Google that are more than 45 days long. And there's a whole bunch of individual projects that are 15 days long. And I suggest that a 15-day and a 45-day are ideal cognitive cycles for a single person or a three-person team. And in this model, by the way, is there anybody from Gartner here or Forrester? Good. Because I think who cares if they've got completeness of vision and ability to execute? You've got 50,000 function points and people are only using 100. Who gives a rat's ass about 50,000 function points and the completeness of vision? So what? It's really about what's your value. Is it intangible, tactical, strategic, or transformational? And how quickly do I get some? What's the time value? This is the model by which I suggest we evaluate technology. What's your value proposition and how quickly can I get some? And I suggest by breaking everything down into 15-day and 45-day projects and executing those aggressively, we end up creating strategic, if not transformational value as a function of executing consistently on 15 and 45-day projects. So part of the job of a chief innovation officer is to own the process, own the framework by which we right-size things down to 3 to 15-day projects, and then managing that just like a manufacturing process. Hence the term an agile, lean enterprise. Okay. Now, this I stole from Clayton Christensen's The Innovator's Dilemma. It basically says there are some things that will agree with the values of a corporation, and there are things that won't work with existing processes. So for a disruptive innovation, almost always you need to have a heavyweight team. Now, a heavyweight team basically means they don't give a rat's whatever about the prevailing rules and protocols of the organization, because they understand that they have to create new rules, new protocols, new accountabilities, and new processes. So that's why oftentimes the best organizational unit for a disruptive startup is going to be outside the company, a skunk works. Right? They're going to raise their Jolly Roger. They're going to have the skull and bones writing as their flag. They're going to get outside the organization. Now, if you're just kind of doing a sustaining innovation, that's great to do inside. But I'll tell you, more great ideas have died a horrible, bloody death as a function of trying to do them with existing HR policies, with existing accounting policies, with the existing LDAP rules, and all that other horseshit that goes with the administrative of being an employee. Single largest source of death of great ideas. Trying to do it within a corporate culture whose antibodies will surround and kill it. Okay, now, this is why CMOs basically hire what I call Ronins, ninjas, and Sherpas. Now, a Ronin is from Japanese samurai culture. And a Ronin is essentially a samurai warrior whose liege lord has died an honorable death and then become a free agent. So a Ronin is essentially a one-person system integration firm. Great example, a guy named Manish Malik. Now, Manish, when I met him, he was in one of my tutorials that I was doing on digital asset management. And he kept asking me really great questions. I mean, some of the best questions I've ever been asked in a tutorial. And I go, wow. So at the break I said, Manish, what do you look for? He said, well, GM. So are you in GM? Like, oh no, I'm a consultant. He said, well, what are you doing there? Oh, I'm executing a digital supply chain strategy for marketing. Now, this was 7 years ago, right? And I'm going, well, what does that mean? He says, well, it means that we want to put all of our content and all of our marketing processes in kind of an online supply chain management framework. Oh, got it. And so I said, well, how do you work? And he says, well, look, I have a very simple business model. And I said, what do you mean? He says, well, I have a perishable inventory of 220 billable days a year. And my whole goal is to sell them in 90-day chunks. So my question to you, he says, is what can you do to sell me? What can you do to sell an additional tranche of 90 days from my inventory? If you have a plausible conversation, I'm all ears. But if there's no correlation between how you help me monetize my perishable inventory of days, you're just noise. Get out of my way. Great. So that's a great example of a Ronin. A Ronin basically is a CMO, like Ansi, will hire Manish to come in and to drive a complex project on weekly milestones. And Manish says, look, my whole thing is a weekly report. And after I come back for 2 or 3 weeks where I have not delivered what I said I'm going to, I don't get invited back for the 4th. That's accountability. And as I talk to CMOs, he says, look, I have not yet figured out how to get employees to do that, to work like that. So we hire people to come in and get those things done. So ninjas are the technical equivalent, and Sherpas are the strategy guys. So this, if you will, is part of the team, and oftentimes this business analyst and this technology integrator, there's our ninja, there's our Ronin, and here's our ninja, and they work within a company, a project manager and a change agent. I want to call attention to this one last thing called an organizational historian. Now, every organization, every organization has a whole bunch of cultural norms that are largely unconscious. They're just like habits of mind. And I suggest that whenever we want to think about doing a change project, we always ask around, well, who's the organizational historian here? And people go, what do you mean, the organizational historian? He says, well, who around here kind of knows how things get done? Oh, you're talking about Sue. She's over in, product management. I'm talking about Mark. He does documentation. And I said, well, so we're not talking about a high stats position often. But Sue or Mark will have made it their personal hobby to document, at least internally, how things get done in the organization. So you want to make sure that you always find out who the organizational historian is in your company and ask them, hey, here's what I'm thinking about doing. Who do you suggest I talk to about how to kind of socialize this change into? And they'll tell, oh, well, geez, you're going to take this to Ellen over here. You really have to have a business case all right. So you only go to her after you got a business case. Because if you go to her without a business case, well, the whole thing will just, it'll throw you back a couple months. So I'm suggesting that part of the job of a chief innovation officer is to really understand and treasure and really partner with these organizational historians who will tell you how things can get done and will get done with the least amount of noise and resistance.
I go, 5 minutes?
Cool. Well, let me conclude with one story. Actually, Courtney gave me the hint. So now I want to talk about and conclude on this notion of how do you sponsor, how do you evoke insanely great innovations? So in the late 70s, I worked at a company called Regis McKenna, and I worked on the Apple and Intel accounts back when they were just really breaking out. And so I got to know and work with Steve Jobs for a little bit, and then later in the 90s when he came back. And one of the guys that Steve worked with, do I need a microphone? Sorry. One of the things that Steve was able to do, he was able to pull things out of people that they didn't know they had. And I never really understood that until I started my own advertising agency back in the 80s. And I worked with the same design company called Mark Anderson Design. Now Mark, his shop did the whole original brand identity for the Macintosh, you know, like the little Picasso Matisse color thing, and we did the whole Apple logo and stuff. And so one day I'm down, and I was working on a project. I was doing the brand identity for SideQuest. Remember the movable hard disk? So that was my project. So I'm down in Mark's shop in Palo Alto, on Lytton Avenue, just off of University Avenue. And Mark says, "You want to see something cool?" And I said, "Sure." So over in the corner, there was an easel, almost like this, with a burlap sack, round burlap. He says, "I want to show you something." I said, "What is it?" He says, "Steve wanted me to design, Steve wanted to have a personal card." And I said, "Well, what's wrong with Apple Computer? Open." You know? He says, "Well, you know, when he's out, you know, seeing the ladies and stuff, he doesn't want to give his business card because they'll call in and then they become the whole point of gossip within the secretarial pool, and he hates that. So he set up a whole answering service just to handle his social life. And he wanted a card for it. And I said, "Cool. What's the creative reason?" He says, "Well, here's what Steve told me." He says, "Mark, I want a card that is over the top. I want a card unlike any other card you've ever seen or thought about. Now, I want this to be the best blankety blank work that you've done in 30 years. I want you 30 years from now, I want you to look back and say, that was the highlight of my design career." Okay? So I want you to come up with those. I want you to set them aside for 2 days and then burn them. And then come back and do something that you cannot even imagine doing now. That's what I want. So then he folds back the thing. And there were 8 cards. There were 2 columns, 2 columns. Just 4 here and 4 here. And then Mark says, "Which one do you like?" I said, "Well, I like this one on the second from the top here." And it was got this nice little kind of curly hue color, kind of very kind of fanciful, you know. But they had kind of like this opalescent kind of sheen to them. It was really cool. Yeah, you know, what do you like? There was the third one on the right column. Be like that. Now this was this unbelievably deep black charcoal gunmetal opalescent gray, and it had this kind of warp to it, and there were these little elements, a red circle, a yellow triangle, a purple square, and just like these little geometric shapes that were like kind of floating in this vast three-dimensional space. He says, yep, those are all matched colors. So that card went through a printing press, a 4-color printing press, 3 times. Because each color had required its own plate. And it had 2 varnishes. So the little colors actually had a shiny varnish on it, and the matte, it was kind of this matte opalescent on the charcoal. So this thing said, yeah, well, expense was no object. And I said, wow. And I looked at the card, and on the card, there was just one thing. There was, in 6-point type, 332, 415, 332, something. 6-point type. It's all, just a telephone number. And I said, what's up with that? He says, well, Steve believes that if he gives you a card, and that you don't remember who gave it to you, he doesn't want you to fucking call him. That is the creative brief for the iMac, the iPod, the iPhone, and the iMac. That if I give this to you, when you walk into the store and if you pick this up, if you do not have a visceral, immediate, unconscious, bottom-up thrill, then I have failed to bake into that what I need to do as a creator. So fundamentally, he's been doing his business card every product. I submit that that is the job of a chief innovation officer. The job of a chief innovation officer is to have not just a vision, but the ability to edit, to strip away, to make something just so uniquely itself that when people have an experience of it, they go, wow, cool, I want it. So, I'm on time, right? We have time for questions?
Yes, we do.
Yeah.
Yeah, Michael, it's easier for me to see some of these ideas in software and services and maybe even retail.
Sure.
But are you seeing them creeping into other more hardware-oriented businesses, manufacturing, for example?
Absolutely.
And I ask that because in the back of my mind I have the potential of 3D printing. So you can take that, kind of map these ideas and collapse. But is that starting to happen at this point?
The short answer is yes. It's already happening. And the longer answer is that, so for example, with Nokia. Nokia had like 80 different phones, but it had one platform. So basically what they did was the whole supply chain was based around skinning the underlying technology platform. So really what you're talking about there is really mastery of a supply chain, right? And having an architecture, kind of a design architecture that into which we can put good, better, best components and thereby differentiate it. Does that answer your question?
Close enough, I think.
Okay, cool. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Experimentation is a part of the innovation process. I didn't see you talking about it, but there is a little bit of bad connotation to all the major corporations. They think you're playing the sandbox, which normally is not a good thing. So what do you think? I'd like to get your view on that.
Well, once you get to a certain size, most companies become really stupid in terms of innovation. And it's just kind of a natural evolution, and it takes real leadership to shake that up.
Yeah.
So when Lackley was at Procter & Gamble, that was probably one of the most productive periods in Procter & Gamble's history. Then he leaves and they go back to their stupid old ways. So it may well be that the ultimate challenge for organizations is to deconstruct it into a series of federated operating units that are sufficiently small that they can still have kind of an entrepreneurial quality. I don't know. I don't really spend a lot of time in large organizations with the lack of that. I'm not really a consultant there. I'm more of an consultant. Just out of my, but thanks, Mom.
Well, round of applause for Mike. Take the time.